So we're back from break, and we were just talking about what a new global currency would look like. Can you tell me what would happen with the dollar if it was replaced by a global currency?
Well, sure. So again, the whole intuition behind why does it benefit the U.S. or Americans to have the dollar be the reserve currency in the first place was, simplifying a little bit, but basically the idea is we were printing up dollar bills and sending them abroad, and then people were sending us real goods and services in exchange, and then they were just holding the dollar bills as their money. And so it was like we were the printing press for the world, and so that's a great scheme for the person who has the printing press. So now what's going to happen if the world all of a sudden says, you know what, with all the bailouts that you guys are doing, we just don't trust the dollar anymore. Let's either switch to gold or let's switch to, some basket of currencies where the dollar now is only 20% of the basket rather than being 100% as it is right now. What that means effectively is the demand to hold dollars around the world will drop like a stone. And again, loosely speaking, it's as if all these dollar bills are going to flow back to the United States because people are going to say, well, if I'm not holding the dollar as a reserve, what am I going to do with it? I might as well buy something in the United States and get rid of these dollars that are now burning a hole in my pocket. And so all these dollar bills, in effect, will flow back to the country, and that would push up prices here. Because what would happen is, in other words, all the inflation we've sort of been getting by with on the cheap all these decades from printing up more dollars than we are producing goods and services behind it would catch up with us. Because, we were getting away with it all this time because people were holding the dollars as part of their cash balances. And now if all these foreigners say we don't want to hold it anymore, it would come back and push up prices here. So you would see large price inflation in the U.S. if that were to happen.
So the fiat dollar has really been helped by this status this whole time. Can other central banks act the same way with their currency, or do things like what we saw with Iceland and Argentina happen to them if they do?
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem with other fiat currencies. If it's not the world reserve, that when you print up more, if it's only your people basically who are using the currency, if you just start printing it like crazy, its value on the foreign exchanges drops pretty quickly because foreigners aren't holding it in their pocketbooks, so to speak. They're just, if you print up some new money, if the European Central Bank prints up euros and buys some foreign goods with it, if the people in that country don't want to just hold euros as money, then they just give it to, the foreign currency markets, and that pushes down the value of the euro against other currencies. So it's hard the way you get to a position where you can inflate and get away with it without too much penalty is the more people in the world who use your currency as actual money. And so that's the position the U.S. is in. So right now, there's no country that can rival the U.S. in terms of prestige and military might and perceived economic strength the way the U.S. could in the post-war period. So I think the only way you could do it right now, if I were running a central bank, I would tie it to gold. I would just start buying massive quantities of gold, and that's what a lot of central banks are doing, especially the oil-producing nations. A lot of them are literally stockpiling physical gold. So I think they see this storm coming, and they're getting ready for it. So that's the way you might get more people around the world to hold your currency in the beginning, is to tie it to something stable like gold, which is what the U.S. did originally, and then maybe they would phase it out, over time as people got lulled into complacency.
So all that stuff on the Fed's balance sheet, that our dollar's not exactly tied to that, right? Or is it? The sorry mortgages and everything that they bought up, especially since this TARP fund?
Right. I mean, a lot of times people will say something like, oh, yeah, the only thing backing up the dollar bill is the full faith and credit of the U.S., or they'll say it's the assets on the Fed's book. But really, I mean, there's a loose sense in which that's true, but no, I mean, the dollar bill in your wallet, that doesn't entitle you to anything. If you take a $20 bill and go up to the Federal Reserve and say, what do I get for this?
They're not going to give you part of a house.
Right. They're not going to give you a mortgage-backed security. They're going to say, $20 bill, I'll give you 2 10s or 4 5s. What do you want?
Correct.
I mean, so the dollar bill isn't a claim on anything. So it's a pure fiat currency. So, I mean, it's bad if the stuff the Fed bought tanks in value because that's, just showing that they create all that money for no good reason. But strictly speaking, that doesn't really affect you or me if the Fed's balance sheet, if the Fed has to take a write-down on its assets. Really, that just affects the shareholder, the people who own the Fed.
Okay, I see. So I'm just going to go into your article that you wrote called "The Fed as Giant Counterfeiter." In that article, you set up 3 things that the Federal Reserve does in its partnership with the government to act as the government's basic giant counterfeiting machine. First, you tell us that the Fed purchases 48% of all of the market and Treasury bonds, at least in 2009, and by doing so, it pushes up the price for U.S. debt. Why is it bad for the government to be making more money on its debt? Isn't that what we want?
Sure. Just to clarify, that was in the second quarter of 2009.
Oh,
that
sorry.
it was 40%, 48%. Well, so it's, again, so your listeners understand the process. The Treasury, when it runs a deficit, the U.S. government wants to spend more money that it takes in taxes, so it has to borrow the difference. So the U.S. Treasury auctions off bonds, and then people in the private sector buy them initially, so they're lending money to the government so Uncle Sam can go buy tanks and, send Social Security checks or whatever he wants to do. And so people in the private sector now hold these bonds, which have been issued by the Treasury, and then the Federal Reserve comes in and writes checks out of thin air and buys some of those bonds and then adds it to the Fed's balance sheet. So the Fed, as an additional buyer of these bonds, pushes up their price. But the thing with bonds is the higher the price, that means the lower the yield, which is the interest rate. So the federal government likes this arrangement because when the Fed buys its debt, it lowers the interest rate. So it makes it so that the government can borrow money on cheaper terms.
I see.
So just like the fact
like
that
Fannie and Freddie making the market for the mortgages, always sort of paying a little bit of a premium on the debt.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is right. That people in the private sector, when the Treasury auctions off these bonds, they know the Fed is a willing secondary market, and so people are willing to pay more. They're willing to lend to the government on better terms, knowing that if they need to, they can unload their bonds to the Fed and get a good price for it. So it's sort of like how people are worried, what if China stopped lending us money? In effect, it's like the Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and then lends it to the government. And so it's like the Fed is this separate country that is really happy to lend tons of money to the U.S. government. So that's, of course, the U.S. government likes that arrangement.
Yeah. Except for the Fed is part of our country, and they're going to destroy us doing it.
Well, right, but I'm just trying to explain why do the politicians like having a central bank. It's because a bunch of the new money it creates out of thin air is used to buy Treasury debt. And so that's very convenient for the government. It's like if you were a business person making a certain type of car, and then there was a counterfeiter out there with a printing press, and he used most of the $100 bills he created to buy your car.
I would have
you would
no
like
problem
that. You would
with
say,
that.
yeah, I don't have a problem with that counterfeiter, because you would be one of the first merchants that he would spend his money on.